Woof woof and namaste. This is Hilldog and welcome to Kanha Cast, a series of conversations with visitors and residents of Kanha Shanti Vanam, the International Center for Heartfulness near Hyderabad in Telangana, India. Today I'm in conversation with Eddie Stern. Eddie Stern is one of the foremost yoga teachers in the United States. He has been teaching yoga since 1989, and his students have included some well-known personalities including Madonna, Gwyneth Paltrow, Mike D from the Beastie Boys, and Lou Reed. His book, One Simple Thing, has been greatly appreciated and is considered one of the classics of contemporary yogic literature. To know more about Eddie and his online and in-person classes, you can visit eddiestern.com. Do also check out his upcoming series with Deepak Chopra, the Conscious Well-Being series. Eddie was in Kanha Shanti Vanam for the Integrated Health and Wellness Conference, and we caught up for a chat after he had given a presentation there on yogic research. First thing I wanted to ask you, Eddie, is that you grew up in New York. And after that, you've become a real expert on yoga. So how did you get your start in yoga? How did you get interested? How did you discover you were interested?
I was at a summer camp when I was 15. They offered yoga it was like 1 or 2 weeks. They had a yoga program, and I went to do the yoga classes. And I remember that it was basically, reflecting back a Shivananda-style yoga. But at the end, when we did Shavasana, every time I would go into the void. I would go into a deep, state of nothingness, and I wouldn't emerge from it until the teacher woke us back up. And I knew that it wasn't sleep, it was someplace else. And I was really captivated by that. It made a little change in my consciousness. I was scared to do it when I went back home because I thought if I go into the void on my own, there's no one to wake me up. And I was only coming out of it when the teacher woke me up. And I thought, what if I go into the void and I stay there and my parents don't know how to bring me out of it because they're not yoga teachers, and so I'm stuck there forever. So I didn't do any more yoga on my own. And when I was 18, I was working in a record store in Greenwich Village called Bleecker Bob's, and there was a guy there named Ted Biorik. He had received Shaktipat from Amrit Desai in the 1970s and had this Kundalini experience that lasted for about a month, where he basically entered into this unity consciousness state and was full on, just in it. And then that state faded and he could never quite recapture it, but he kept on doing some yoga practices. So he became my first teacher. But he wasn't a yoga teacher himself, but he knew some stuff. So he told me the first thing you need to do is become a vegetarian. So I did, and then he gave me some books to read. I still have a couple of them with me. And we never did any yoga asanas. He didn't really know any, but it was mainly vegetarian diet, reading about samadhi and kundalini, and trying to meditate. And that was it. So as soon as I started reading some of these books and going a little bit deeper on my own, I started seeing that the states that were spoken of in the texts were very similar to things I experienced from taking psilocybin or LSD, and I wasn't living a very healthy lifestyle. So at that point I thought, I can do this and move in the direction I want to without using substances. So then I became totally clean. By the time I was 19, I had stopped using anything that I had been using and just devoted myself to spiritual life and to being on a quest. And also when I was 15, after I'd had that yoga experience, I went to school. I was in 9th or 10th grade. And I remember very clearly one of the books we first read that year was Siddhartha, and I had a very strict English teacher, Jane Benditson. And she said to us, the 3 most important questions you can ask yourself in your life are, who am I, what am I doing here, and what do I do next? And these questions captivated me because I was not happy in school. I wasn't terribly happy in my life at that time. I doubted that there was anything for me to learn in school. I doubted that I was going to be able to get into a university or even want to go in that direction. So those 3 questions from that time became the sort of focal point of my life. And I was always asking myself, like, who am I? Like, what story am I telling about myself? And what am I doing here? What is my purpose? And then how can I act on that? So that's been with me since then. And I keep speaking about her and speaking about those questions. And when I first went to India when I was 21, I just turned 21 when I first came here, I went to Ramana Ashram and I saw his inquiry method, the Vicharana, and I thought, oh my God, this is what Mrs. Benditson taught me, and so I was right at home and I felt like, okay, this is the right path.
Wow. So this experience in summer camp, were you able to share it with your friends? I mean, did anybody else also experience something similar?
No, not at all. I have no idea what anyone else experienced or thought. And at that particular camp, I did not have a lot of friends. I was pretty much by myself. Most of the time I had a guitar with me and I was, sitting in my room when I wasn't doing the activities, learning how to play punk rock songs and Neil Young and stuff like that. So no, I was living an interior life even then. And I think probably a little bit of a lonely life too, even though I was around people.
So after that experience at summer camp, when did you decide to take your interest in yoga further and visit India?
Before I came to India, I already knew yoga was what I was going to devote my life to. And I remember very clearly when I first had that flash of like, this is the thing, this is my investigation, this is what I'm going to do. There was no yoga industry at the time. You couldn't make a living being a yoga teacher. There weren't yoga classes on every corner. There were no yoga mats. There was no yoga clothing. There was nothing like that. It was like you only did this because you were on a spiritual quest. And this is 1987. And then when I came to India, I left end of 88, right after Christmas. I didn't know anything about India. I didn't know a single thing. In fact, I didn't even know where I was going in India. I just knew I was going with the Swami and we were going to go to the ashram. And I didn't even know what an ashram was. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And, but I liked it, And I had been to the Kripalu ashram in 1987 and experienced the life there a little. I'd gone to Shivananda Center on 24th Street in New York and I experienced a little bit what was happening there. So, but I didn't know anything about India. And when I got here, it was not overwhelming because I was from Greenwich Village and I was used to a little bit of chaos, but it was a new kind of a chaos and I liked it. And somehow, growing up on the streets of New York, I had a little bit of fearlessness in me for just being in a culture and going for it. I mean, it was sort of like going to CBGB's and going to a punk rock show and throwing yourself in the mosh pit. Like you just throw yourself in, you get thrown around by the people, and you somehow emerge fine. And and it's a cathartic experience. So I spent a month or so at the ashram, did the teacher training, and then I traveled by bus and by train from Kerala to Kathmandu and went to all of the major temples and some of the minor temples along the way. And it was just a 3 or 4 month long yatra and not under great conditions either. But that's what I was doing. It was like I was going to be in India and I was going to experience it, even though I didn't know what it was. And being in the temples of South India particularly, and in North India too, but particularly in South India where there are these huge sprawling structures of ancient stone. And we would go find a quiet corner of the temple and we'd roll out our straw mats and we'd do asanas and pranayama and chant and meditate and do sadhana in these temples. 3 days in one temple, 3 days in another as we traveled. And yoga came to life for me in the temples of India. So I had that immediate connection with puja, with the deities, with this feeling of devotion, with a sense of being in a sacred space to do something sacred with your body in order to learn something about who who you were and what the universe was. So very much so, my understanding of yoga has been defined by temple life and continues to be so, because we run a Ganesh temple in New York City. So, and sometimes people, they wonder why, or they raise an eyebrow or at it. And but for me, it's home, and I don't want to be in a sterile environment with nothing in it that's not evocative of something that says the spirituality, the religion, the aesthetics of India, where yoga came alive for me. So I didn't know, after my first trip to India, I didn't know that I'd come back again. And after my second trip, I didn't know that I was going to come back every year for the next 30 years either. I had no idea what was in store, but that's what happened.
Wow, that's amazing. It's amazing that you felt so comfortable and at home in India right at once. So you mentioned you took a yoga teacher training course here. So was that always a part of the plan to become a yoga teacher?
Well, what happened was, at that time, I was doing Kundalini yoga with Ravi Singh. I was going to a teacher named Dharma Mitra, who was on 4th Street at the time, and I was going to the Jivamukti Yoga Society, which is what it was called back then. And Sharon Gann and David Life, who had started the Yoga Society, said to me, why don't you go to India and take the teacher training, and when you come back you can teach some classes in our school. So that's why I went and took the teacher training. I thought that, up until that point, I thought, in order to teach yoga, you need to be enlightened. You have to raise your kundalini. Otherwise, how can you teach yoga? That was my understanding, just from reading all the books I'd been reading. So I was super naive that that was not the case. And when they said, it was Sharon who suggested that, I was like, how could I possibly be a teacher? And I have no idea even where India is, where you would go. And Ravi Singh had also said to me, you have some connection from a past life as a teacher. You should be teaching in this life as well. So I thought, how could I possibly do that? So I'm a 21-year-old kid, and yoga's not a thing. So I'm like, really? Anyway, so that's why I went. I went and took that training, and then that led to all my months of travels. And then when I came back, I started teaching, and I wasn't terribly good at it. And because nobody is in the beginning, it takes a lot of practice. My voice was too quiet, and, I would forget things and all this stuff. But I thought that I could do it because I'd gone to this training and people said you can go ahead and teach. So I just kept doing it. So yeah, that's when I started teaching. 21, and that's all I've been doing since then. Now I'll be 55 in a couple of days.
Wow. So at 21, you were a yoga teacher. But you also have your own spiritual quest. You were on a quest. You were learning. Was it difficult to juggle roles of a teacher and a learner?
Yeah, it wasn't so much a matter of swapping roles, because I was always learning and I was always studying and practicing. But I think that what happened was, I had not been doing yoga for a long time, so I knew literally nothing. And I hadn't been teaching for a long time, so I knew literally nothing about teaching. And so the combination of lack of experience of both of those things got me to the point within about a 2-year period where I felt like I didn't know what yoga meant to me anymore. I had a small amount of reserve that I'd built up of experience, you could say, of, the Shakti that you build up from practice. But I gave it away because I hadn't baked my vessel yet. And so after 2 years in 1991, I felt like I'm losing connection about what yoga means to me, so I'm going to stop teaching. And so then I went back to India. I'd gone the year before anyway. I'd already been going. But I thought, I'm going to stop teaching. I'm going to leave Jivamukti. I'm going to go just do sadhana for as long as I need to in India until I reconnect with that that spark, that essence of practice again and of yoga. So that's what I did, and then I didn't teach for another couple of years.
Wow. So you were able to keep that spirit of learning alive, that spirit of wanting to know more, of being on a quest. Today, yoga is largely understood as a physical practice. I mean, most of us think of it as something that you do along with other physical activity like CrossFit, like running, and yoga is part of that entire offering. But for you, it started with a spiritual experience. So has yoga for you always been inherently spiritual?
It was always inherently spiritual until I got to Mysore and started learning Ashtanga yoga, which I studied for about 25 years. And then it became much more physically oriented because as much as I think it's a very good practice, it is lacking in certain things. There's basically no pranayama which is taught or done, and there's no meditation which is done. There's not much of an emphasis on service or the other aspects of yoga. So it's simply, for the most part, asana and concentration and willpower training, and it's very, very good for that. But for me, and not for everyone, but for me, there were elements that seemed to not round out what my spiritual search needed to have in it. So I learned a lot during my many years of study there, and I have a lot of gratitude for what I learned, and I continue to teach what I learned. But there was a distinctive shift in the nature and quality of how I was pursuing a spiritual life during those years when I was there. And I don't necessarily blame the teacher of that school of yoga or of the people who were engaged in it, but there was something about the whole setup which was very much geared towards doing asanas, being good at doing asanas, doing hard asanas, and always pushing yourself to go as deep as you could, even on days when you weren't up for it, you were tired, you were sick, you were broken, all those things. One of the things that did happen over all those years, though, was you do develop a great strength of mind, and you do develop discipline, and you do develop the sense of regularity of practice, and that's a very important thing. However, for me and for other people as well, there needs to be more of a fullness, because yoga is a multimodality practice. And if you are focusing on extreme physicality all the time, like many of us were, you don't have the energy for doing the other things that you need to do to address the other bodies that we're made up of. The pranamaya kosha, manomaya kosha, vijnanamaya kosha, anandamaya, etc. You simply don't have the energy because you're working so hard in that one direction. So that was my personal experience, and it's not everyone's experience, and it's probably more of a indicator of my nature than it is of necessarily the nature of that particular school of yoga. And I think that when it comes to schools of yoga and systems, often systems have one or two flaws. It's part of something being a system. And when you start reaching more and more people, the system has to become more and more organized in order to address the larger amounts of people coming in. That's definitely something that I've seen happen in several organizations over the years. And so as you have masses of people, then either of two things happen. One, because your system is complicated, you have to simplify it. And in simplifying it so much, you lose a little bit of the personalization that gave it its spiritual progress or its flavor. And then things start to shift. So that's one thing that happens. But if you happen to have a a system which is based on simplicity already, then you don't sacrifice quality when there's more of a quantity of people coming in. So this is in the different things I've observed happening primarily in India, that if there's a simplicity of approach from the start, it can handle masses of people, and you don't have to sacrifice because the simplicity is already there. But if it's very complicated and demands a tremendous amount of a particular type of a person to do it, then, and the teaching is also specialized, then as the quantities of people increase, then the quality of the teaching is going to diminish. And so I've seen this in different situations, and then I've seen the opposite to be true as well. And that's very interesting to observe. It's interesting to observe how can you think about spiritual discipline in a way which is utterly simple and yet utterly effective. And because I'm a very complicated person by nature, I like complicated 3-hour-long pujas. I like memorizing, Upanishads. I'm not a simple person. And so I'm always inspired to see how can we find the most direct, simplest way of doing an effective practice that affects transformation and change and growth and positivity that doesn't need to be overly complicated. So this is, and this is actually something really interesting about heartfulness that I've observed over the past few days. And so those are some of my thoughts just on my years in India. And when I think about, as I continue on a spiritual practice and on a spiritual journey, which I still happen to be on one, what is it going to look like as I begin to calm myself down a little? What is it going to start looking like as I embrace simplicity as part of my nature? And, what does it look like when I try to feel a naturalness in my approach to practice rather than too much effort? And Patanjali is clear on effort and asanas. He says, prayatna shaitalya, the effort should be relaxed, and not a relaxation of effort. The effort you do should be relaxed. And then after that, you can have this, alongside that, the ananta samapati, so the cognitive blending of your mind with the infinite. So if your effort is too intense, you can't blend your mind. You can't blend your mind with the infinite because your mind is constricted in your effort. Mm-hmm. So the effort needs to be relaxed in order for your consciousness to expand, your individualized consciousness to expand. And that is basically sthira and sukham. So sthira and sukha, prayatna shaitalya, ananta samapati, these four things line up with each other. And then tato dvandva anubhigataha, you can handle the pairs of opposites. Life is not going to toss you around as much. You'll still experience things and have to deal with suffering, but you will not get completely overwhelmed by it. So, but if there's an excessive effort, if you try too hard, then you don't get stability and you don't get expanded space in practice. You get constriction. And then with constriction comes problems. Maybe a physical problem. You keep hurting your knee, you keep hurting your back because you're pushing too hard. You don't achieve the thing that you want to achieve because, you've set your goals and you're striving too hard for them. And then you get frustrated. All these different problems can arise from too much constriction. So how do you do a practice, even a hard practice, in a very soft way? How do you do a simple practice in a way where you're engaged and you're present, but, you're not just being too lackadaisical about it? So all these things I think about. And I look, and I like to travel around and meet people and see what people are doing so that I can just observe.
So Patanjali says to make efforts, but in a relaxed way. I think I've also heard it referred to as effortless effort. Coming to the role of a teacher, the role of the guru in Indian tradition is hallowed. It's a long tradition. Have you had that relationship? Have you considered someone as your guru?
Well, following within the Indic tradition, I consider that all of the teachers I've had have been my gurus. And some of them have been gurus simply in regard to being someone who gave me yoga instruction. And I've had gurus who have taught me Vedic chanting and how to do puja and philosophy and a bunch of other topics as well. So definitely all of my teachers in India have been my gurus for the field that they've been teaching me in. And I do not currently have, and I don't think I have had, an overarching guru who's my spiritual master, or however you might want to frame it. But that doesn't mean I won't have one in the future. I was studying with a teacher in Mysore for a very long time, for these 19 years or so. And at that time I was devoting myself completely towards him and his teachings. And primarily what I was learning, though, were these practices, asana practices of Ashtanga Yoga. And I learned other things from him as well. I learned some Vedic chanting from him. But there were other things that didn't speak to yoga within that experience. And so when I felt I had learned everything that I could from that, especially after his death, then it came time to me to go back to research, going back into the texts, going back into my studies, and expanding myself again. Right now, I'm doing a master's with the Vivekananda Yoga University. I'm enjoying that a lot as well. So, as Sri Ramakrishna said, as long as I live, so long do I learn. And that's basically what I'm doing. And but I think that yoga exists in India because of the Guru tradition. And you look into all of the Upanishads and all of the conversations between the Guru and the Shishya, and these teachings they're passed down in that tradition. There would be no yoga tradition without the Guru tradition, and I don't think you can separate the two apart. And I think when people do start to separate those things apart, then you get problems of commercialism, of consumerism, of all these types of things that we see happening. In America, and I can't speak for all of the West, but I can speak for America, I don't think that the Guru tradition is working very well. And pretty much anyone can observe that. Lots of problems have occurred. And there are a lot of Westerners who try to be gurus too, and that usually does not go well either. So I've been saying for a long time that I think that a nice model for us to follow is that of spiritual friendship. That, okay, fine, I'm teaching some yoga, I might be a yoga instructor. But all that means is that if you come to me, I can teach you some postures and some breathing and maybe something for your mind. And that's about the limits of it. And you can teach me some stuff too, about whatever you happen to know as well. You might have great spiritual insights because you've suffered a lot in your life, or because you had some experience, and I can learn from that as well. So as spiritual friends, maybe I might be a little further down the road because I've been walking on this road for a while, so I can show you some of these things. But we have to keep everything, rational, because people spin out of control with power and greed, and a thirst for control of stuff, and a thirst for having people serve them. So now there are some exceptions to that also. For example, there are people who grow up within the Hare Krishna movement, and they're very much trained in Gurukul. And so there are a lot of Westerners who become gurus within the Hare Krishna tradition who don't have those problems that a yoga teacher is going to have. And the reason they don't have those problems, I mean, some of them do, but there's the ones that I know are doing amazingly well. They have a foundation in bhakti, they have a foundation in seva, they have a foundation in philosophy, and most importantly, really intensive practice. Because, even just as a Hare Krishna initiative, you have to chant 16 rounds of Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, actually Hare Krishna, Hare Rama every day. That takes a couple of hours. So you're going to be really dedicated to
Yeah, you would have bailed out long ago if you weren't dedicated.
Yeah, totally. And there's a humility that has to be built into that as well. So that's an exception, for example, of how a Westerner can live the life of a guru, because there's a whole different context. But as a yoga teacher who's, even if they've taught their quote-unquote 10,000 hours, which is, I'm sorry, ridiculous.
Is there such a log? Do people keep such a log, like the flight log of a airline pilot?
Well, there's a whole Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours to expertise type of a thing.
Oh, okay.
And everyone latches onto that. And I honestly think it's a little silly, and I'm not alone.
So at the 9,999th hour,
if you quit then, what's going to happen? You're out of luck, man. Sorry. So if you are an independent person and you don't have a structure around you for checks and balances, and you think that either you've created your own system of yoga, or you think that you've created your own system. And so most of the people who have had the downfalls in the West are the people in those positions. They think that they're gurus, or they're respected as gurus. They've created their own things. Problems have occurred. Things fall apart. So I'm in that culture. I should look at that as a Westerner and go, all right, here's how things fall apart. Make sure that doesn't happen to you. What framework do you want to follow? Choose one which is based on something more democratic. And so friendship is very democratic. And also, Patanjali says clearly in chapter 3 of Yoga Sutra, the greatest strength or the greatest power we can get of all the vibhutis really is the power of friendship. And this is spoken of in the commentaries as well. And the Brahma Viharas, the four immeasurables that you have in Buddhism, the first one is Maitri, which is friendship or friendliness. And in Yoga Sutra, Maitri is the first one in chapter 1, verse Sutra 33. Maitri, Karuna, friendship is spoken of as first. So there's a few hints that we can look at to the text that say what's really important when we're interfacing with people, this feeling of friendliness. And so I think that's a good model. I try to use that one. And even when I have been in India teaching some classes, which I don't teach a lot in India. Sometimes because it's part of the Indian culture, people will try to touch my feet when they're done. But I don't let them, because this isn't my culture. It might be your culture, but it's not mine, and I'm not going to take on something from your culture which might cause a problem for me later, like thinking that I deserve to have my feet touched. That might be bad for my sense of self, which some people call the ego. So you have to be vigilant. You absolutely have to be vigilant, because things can spin out very quickly.
And you must be, as a teacher, in that position that you could, people will want to make you a guru.
Yeah, some people want to call me things I don't want to be called. When Western people call me Eddie G, I'm like, don't call me that. Just call me Eddie, please.
If you were a saxophone player with a Grammy Award-winning album, Eddie
then
G.
I could be Eddie G. I could be a Kenny G. I could be a Eddie G. Any of those would be fine. So, yeah, and I like to talk about these things also with people, because when younger yoga teachers also are going to start to think about these things and maybe get more popular, like, watch out. Because we set into this on a spiritual quest. Like, you come to yoga, anyone's going to come to yoga not thinking, oh, I want to be a famous guru. You come into it thinking, I want to know who I am. I want to reduce my suffering. I want to reduce my stress. I want to grow. I want to transform. I want to open. And so we have to make sure that we remember that all the time. And the strengthening of memory is key in the yoga practices. And I don't know anything about heartfulness. I started reading the collected works of Ramchandra today, and I have the Heartfulness book that I was given that I started reading yesterday. And I see constant remembrance in these books, and I really love that. I'm excited to read more about these books, because in yoga, there's a particular sutra, chapter 1 of Patanjali, Shraddha Virya Smriti Samadhi Prajna Purvaka Iteresham, which is that in order to attain this first level of samadhi, the first thing you need is conviction that you're moving in the right direction. And from your conviction, some people call it faith, but faith comes from actually believing that what you're doing is good. But you need to experience something. So if you remember the experience and you have conviction of the experience, that gives you faith. If you start with faith, it might not be quite as good as tasting, the honey first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then that leads to great vitality, shraddha, virya. And the vitality leads to smriti, which is the strengthening of memory or remembrance. And remembering not only that what you're doing is good and you're going on the right path, but you're remembering that you want to remember who you truly are. And that leads to samadhi, the deep absorption. And from samadhi, is not the end point, comes prajna, which is wisdom, intuition, the wisdom about the arising of knowledge, the arising of experience, of being. And that increases and strengthens shraddha, conviction. So it becomes a feedback loop within itself. And it kind of swings on the fulcrum of smriti. And you see that a lot. In Katha Upanishad, ahara shuddhau, sattva shuddhihi. And this mantra continues that basically if your food is pure, your mind is pure. If your mind is pure, your memory is strong. If your memory is strong, you can remember who you are. And so the path to self-knowledge in sutras, in Vedas, in Upanishads, has a lot to do with memory. As you know all these things anyway, so I don't need to be saying them to you. So
no, don't get me wrong. I'm nodding my head, but I don't know half of what you're saying.
Yeah. So I normally don't know half of what I'm saying either. So between us, we have a whole. You can take one half. I'll take the other.
Sure.
So this strengthening of memory is really important, and the memory then also comes into play. Like when we start to go off track, if we don't have someone to tell us you're going off track, then you have to recognize it yourself. That's hard. That requires a refinement and a subtlety of intellect to notice, when am I veering off from my compass, of my values, of my true north, to catch that and to catch it quickly, and to remember why you're here, to remember what you're doing, to remembering what your purpose was when you set out, to remember the spark that came along when you first started doing these practices, because things can get stale. And stuff can come up, and you don't want to get lost there. Everyone's going to, but if you can get lost there for shorter periods of time, then that's good. And so what a spiritual friend or a teacher should do is be able to help people not get too lost.
Sure. I really like what you said about vigilance, because it's so easy to lose vigilance, especially something that you're really familiar with and comfortable with. One starts to take for granted and loses the vigilance at that point.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to the issue of awareness, that we're trying to enhance or develop our awareness through these practices. And the vigilance is an active being present. The awareness is a trait characteristic, which is always there. So if we're dwelling,
you don't have to try for it.
You don't have to try. You're just aware, and you're going to know what's happening. This is something we also read about in yoga and in Buddhism, of the nirmana chitta, the constructed mind of the yogi, who nothing needs to happen in the field of chitta. So chitta won't fluctuate or move. But if you have to have a thought for some reason, or someone asks you a question, then you construct the mind or the thought you need in order to respond to what's in front of you. But then when that is done, your mind goes back to being a clear, empty field of reflection.
That is so beautiful. So since we're speaking about gurus, this is something I've always wondered, Today, we have so many cases of gurus who are charlatans, who are involved in all sorts of illegal and unlawful activities. And but they have a following, and they have people who are, deeply devoted to them. And these people seem genuine and genuinely have this affection for the guru and seem to have genuine spiritual experiences. So how does that work? how do you think that works? Is it like just the act of devotion to anybody opens up something within us? Is that how they are able to have experiences even with a guru who some may say is unworthy? And vice versa too. So many times you find that a guru is really simple and humble, but his followers can often be crass and rude and badly behaved. How do you think that works?
Well, sometimes people by nature are very pure, and so they're ready to transform quickly. And they understand that the people they go to might not be perfect and might have flaws, and they're able to be discerning and take away from those encounters what is going to help them grow and transform, and they don't worry about the rest. Some people worry about the rest. Some people ignore the rest. But one thing that I'd like to mention is two instances. One is Swami Shivananda, who decided almost very spur of the moment to renounce everything as a doctor. And he went up to Benares and was initiated by a Swami who he spent one day with, maybe just a few hours with. We don't know exactly how long. And then he went up to Rishikesh to do tapas and never saw that teacher again. He never saw his initiate guru again. But he received the mantra and he received the initiation, and so now he knew what to do, and he just did it. So he always had that reverence for his initiate guru who plugged him in, to the so-called matrix of spirituality. Nisargadatta Maharaj, who's a very well-known teacher from Mumbai, didn't spend a whole lot of time with his guru either. But what he did was he followed the instructions of his guru to question who he was. And so he did it until he got realization. And so that's all. He learned this one thing, and he did that one thing, and he brought it to its fulfillment. And that was his relationship with his guru. So if we look at the different saints of India, the different teachers of India, if we look into the texts, into whether it's Itihasa or Veda or Upanishads, particularly Upanishads, we'll see that contact with the guru is often limited to a time period. Sometimes it's 12 years, sometimes it's 1 year, sometimes it's just one encounter, sometimes it's just a conversation. And you receive the information you're supposed to have, and then you work on it, and then you question and you figure it out, and you go and work on it. And there are other situations that we see in sort of the modern world right now where people don't work on stuff on their own quite as much, but expect that everything will be fulfilled by a person. And that if they go spend a lot of time by this person, everything will be fulfilled by this person, and they might not have to do too much. Now, I don't know about Indians doing this, but I know about Westerners doing this. And so this is, again, one of the things that I've observed. And then I think it's fine to give your life to another human being if you feel that that is helping you and it's helping the world, then by all means do it. So there's no judgment on that. But since you asked about the guru culture, I haven't read about those kinds of things in text, so I wonder if it might be more of a modern or recent development in that relationship. But that being said, it seems to be helping a lot of people, so I have nothing bad to say about that. I have no criticism of that whatsoever. It seems to be helping a lot of people. And maybe it's the case that all the person does need to do is be around that person and everything will be taken care of. And they don't have to make much effort. Maybe my thinking about these things could be completely backwards and wrong because I've had damaging experiences. So to answer your question, I have no idea. And I think if it's helping a person and it's not harming other people, then by all means do it. But if it is harming people and it's not helpful in the long run, then it's not good. Don't do it. But sometimes it's hard to tell when that's going to happen. And so again, I'm speaking from a very much Western perspective, things I observe happening primarily in the West, not things that are happening in India. So I want anyone who might happen to listen to this be very clear on that. Like, I'm only commenting on the culture I come from and the problems that I've seen arise. And oftentimes people don't like to talk about these things because they think, well, either don't judge, don't criticize, don't,
You want to avoid confrontation.
Avoid confrontation is, maybe it's not for you, but it's for someone. Okay, fine. But at the same time, there's been a lot of people who've been hurt emotionally, sexually, mentally, physically. And in the West, they like to talk about stuff all the time. So you might as well talk about it in a constructive way and examine it. But all we can do is be responsible for our own culture and the way that we behave within our own culture, and then the way we behave when we come to a foreign culture, another culture, the way we behave when we come to India. How are we going to behave with teachers? We need to understand how the teacher needs to be respected. We also have to understand things that we haven't been taught. So, for example, I'll go back to the Hare Krishna movement. They are taught what the qualifications of a guru are, so that when you go looking for one, you know what to look for. And if the person doesn't have those qualifications, then you don't follow them. Or maybe you learn one or two things from them or a particular thing, but you don't give your life to them. And so a 200-hour yoga teacher training or the yoga situation in America, nobody is being taught what are the qualifications of a guru. Literally nobody. I haven't seen it happening. Maybe it's happening in places I haven't seen. So I won't say literally nobody, but we're going to say 98%. That's not part of the conversation. So because we're not getting trained in what are the qualifications and what should we look like, what should we look for and what should we avoid, then we get into trouble, or we think that the person might be something more than they are. And then we also get into trouble because we superimpose our desires on top of that person. So a lot of the stuff that happens also with abuse is because superimposition from the student onto the teacher, and the teacher starts to believe their own press. And then that also can create problems.
Sure.
So education, I think, is very important. If someone is following and wants to follow in these traditions, we have to get educated in the West about what the guru tradition is. And how do we do that? We have to learn from Indian people what the guru tradition is and follow how do they serve their teacher and what are the limits of how they understand what that relationship is about. What are the different types of gurus that there are, and how do you learn from them in different types of ways? Because the guru tradition is very important. As I said before, it's how these things stay alive. So, meaning yoga. So, but it can get damaged if we're not educated about it, like anything.
Sure.
So that's my opinion.
Sure.
And as Groucho Marx said, not about opinions, but about advice, he said, take my advice. I'm not using it. So, even our opinions can quite often, more often than not, be wrong. I hope I haven't said anything offensive.
It's a common question. A lot of people ask this as to how to identify a guru. I mean, there was that book by Paul Brunton, A Search in Secret India, I think it was called, where he traveled amongst yogis and gurus and, basically tried to identify a guru. What do you think is the essential quality of a guru? Is there really a way to recognize a real guru?
Imagine if we were around at the time of Ramakrishna, and we were from Calcutta, and we went to go see this priest who was worshipping Kali, who spent time dressing up as Radha, wearing a sari, and then later on he spent time doing, 5 times a day of the prayers to Allah.
Breaking into song whenever.
And how confusing would it be for us
Absolutely.
to witness that behavior and to not understand it. Some people understood it, but many didn't understand it. But after he died, then everyone started understanding him. So that's an interesting thing, too. And that's primarily through Vivekananda and through the other swamis of the Ramakrishna mission. They didn't sanitize his spiritual quest at all and the things that he did to experience oneness, but he went all out. And for an Orthodox person, especially an Orthodox Hindu, looking at Ramakrishna, it's going to be like, if you don't know he's a saint already, you're going to be like, what's up here?
Yeah.
This guy is...
Sure.
So in talking about quantifying and things like that, a lot of the sages that people in my generation have grown up with are people who have been dead for a long time and who, if we spent time around them, we might not have understood them at all.
So true. So true. I wanted to ask you, in all these years that you've been teaching yoga in America, have you seen America's attitude change towards yoga and spirituality?
Oh, it's been totally corrupted. 100%. In terms of pretty much everything. But that doesn't mean it doesn't still work. Obviously, it's still working, but it's been really corrupted by consumerism. And I'm very happy that I can make a living teaching yoga. It's not a tremendous living, but I can scrape by, and that's great. 30 years ago, it was a lot harder to make a living teaching. It's a little bit more difficult post-COVID than it was pre-COVID, but it's a blessing to be able to do what you love and do what you're passionate about and also survive on that. So that's a great blessing. But I think there's been a tremendous dumbing down of the knowledge base of India through the proliferation of 200-hour trainings. That terminology didn't exist 30 years ago. No one would ever say that. And now everyone all over the world quantifies their things by, I have my 200 hours, I have my 300 hours, I have my 500 hours. And it literally means nothing because someone made this up so they could sell you a product. I'm sorry, that's all it is. They made this up so they could sell you a product. Whether it's the Yoga Alliance or it's primarily the Yoga Alliance. And, not to say that they're a nefarious group of people. They're doing the things that they think is great. But what you have happening is a quote-unquote market being flooded by a tremendous amount of people who aren't super well informed because they think that 200 hours is enough to start teaching. And it's not. 200 hours is enough to start apprenticing someone. 200 hours is enough to decide whether or not you want to commit yourself to this for the next 5 or 10 years. But it's not enough to take on the mantle of a teacher. So you have all these trainings. The trainings proliferated in America because rent is expensive and it's hard to pay the rent on regular classes throughout the day. Teacher trainings and workshops are the things that bring in money to yoga schools. And then you had all these things like the Yoga Journal conferences where they would start teaching the business of yoga. And these were very widely popular they're probably still going on as well. But anyone who came into yoga as a spiritual quest, who they hear the business of yoga, automatically your stomach is going to turn a little bit. And you're going to think, my God, where have we come with all of this? So, and within the business of yoga, some of the things that you're going to learn are teacher trainings are your cash cow. So you have to run 2 or 3 of them a year in order to have enough money to pay the rent and pay your teachers, which is great, so then people can survive. But, what's the cost-benefit analysis of that? So you have a flooded market, and you have untrained teachers, and then you have consumerism on top of it. And then you have products that you need to sell them, like leggings. 40 different types of leggings cost $129. Some of them are quite well made. They'll last for a long time. But the vibe begins to shift.
Sure.
And the vibe begins to shift towards beauty, aesthetics, popularity, things like that. And it begins to shift. So that's one of the things that I've observed. That's a con. There's a lot of pros as well. Yoga has proliferated into every sector of society, and I think that that is very good. It's moved into education, it's moved into healthcare, it's moved into prisons, it's moved into senior care, it's moved into mental health care, it's moved into all these different facets of society that can really benefit from yoga. One of the reasons why that's happened is, it's twofold. One, people in those sectors have started doing yoga because it's become more popular. You have more doctors and nurses doing yoga, so they're going to want to have their patients do it. So this is a very good trickle-down effect which has occurred. So the rising amount of people and the rising popularity in yoga has contributed to yoga becoming more accepted in mainstream. So that's good. Now, if I had to say, well, would you rather that yoga never got commercial and stayed, quote unquote, really pure, and then it didn't move with the same velocity into all these sectors of society? Would you take that, or would you rather that yoga becomes really super commercial and there's some things about it that, you in particular have some pet peeves about, but it reaches so many more people and gets into so many more sectors and it's more accessible? Is that a trade-off you're willing to make? My answer would be yes, 100%. So even though I have a few little pet peeves, and that's just because I'm from New York, and that's how we get, we're territorial, I would say it's a very good trade-off. And so I would encourage the growth of yoga in all directions, and I would also encourage people to be slightly conservative with a commercial mind towards yoga. Just be slightly conservative. Try to remember why we're doing this, where we want it to go, and then we can grow healthier. Otherwise, if these things are allowed to spin out of control, then you're going to get more problems down the road, more than we have already. So we always have to keep ourselves a little bit in check.
Sure.
And so who does that? Who does that? We all have to do it.
Individually, you mean?
Yeah, organizations can't do it because then it's like oversight, and then there's infighting, and then lobbyists, and so individuals, and also in the, I keep saying in the yogic traditions, but we find the 6 poisons: kama, krodha, moha, mada, lobha, matsarya. Anger, greed, delusion, jealousy, greed, sloth. These are very tricky and very subtle. They kind of slip in to our consciousness and overtake us without us even realizing it. That's why they're called the internal enemies, and they can slide in before we know that we've been overtaken by them. And when we're overtaken by them, we think they're okay. We think this greed we have is okay. We think this jealousy we have is justified. We think this laziness is fine. I'll do it tomorrow. That's the thing. When they come into our field of consciousness and they overtake our personality, even if it's momentarily, we always think it's justified. And that's why they're so tricky. So if we start making a lot of money, if we start getting a lot of popularity, if someone is, we view them as a competitor, so we get jealous. These things can take hold. And
Sure.
then we can't really express the same type of discernment as we would like to have, because we've been overtaken by this force. And that force can keep us trapped for long periods of time. Jealous for long periods of time, envious for long periods of time, angry for long periods of time. And those little, they float around on the surface. So what do? You have to keep practicing, keep meditating, keep praying, keep chanting mantras, keep standing on your head, keep doing all these things and do them with awareness. And any of the practices done with awareness are going to help loosen the hold of these 6 poisons. So you got to keep doing them, keep doing these things with awareness, then the hold starts to loosen, and then we correct our course. So what is the key to course correction for some of the problems that arise in America in regards to either consumerism or abuse of power within yoga would be to keep practicing with awareness. And if we just keep practicing with awareness, these things are going to start to smooth themselves out over time. But if we don't practice with awareness and we practice with an eye to achievement, getting really good at a pose, learning hard new poses, figuring out all the tricks to do a pose, etc., or getting lots of followers on social media, that's not practicing with awareness. That's practicing with an eye to the outcome. And we already know from Bhagavad Gita that's not a good idea. The idea of yoga is do what you do without any expectation of a particular outcome. Do it to be fully in that thing you're doing. Yogasta kuru karmani sangam tyaktva dhananjaya. Renouncing attachment to the outcome. Siddhya asiddhyo samobhutva. Having become equal in success or failure. Samatvam yoga uchate. That yoga is equilibrium mind. That type of yoga, or that yoga in general, is said to be equilibrium of mind. So practice established in awareness. Let go of the attachment to outcomes, to wanting a particular outcome. Whether you success or fail, whether you have success or failure, doesn't matter. That is said to be equilibrium, and that's what yoga is. So that's what asana should teach us, what pranayama, meditation, mantra, service, absorption, equilibrium.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, keep on keeping on.
Totally. Totally.
You spoke of yoga reaching new communities and new people, and you yourself have worked with the African American community. How did that come about?
Well, I met a woman named Erica Ford, who is a black woman in South Jamaica, Queens, who runs a nonprofit called Life Camp, which exists to reduce gun violence and was created in response to the heavy levels of gun violence where she lived. I met her through Deepak Chopra and started working with her and working with her team. And our basic, and now I'm on the board of their organization, the basic thing is to use therapeutic wellness, intervention tools, strategy and crisis management and intervention to help reduce gun violence in areas where there's a lot of gun violence in New York. So that's very difficult work. It's very challenging work. There's a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of trauma, and a lot of resistance because of life in the streets and stuff like that. So I can't relate on a personal level, from personal experience, to what that kind of a life is like or what the people who live in those communities have gone through. But I have certain tools I can offer which are helpful, like training young people how to teach yoga or how to teach meditation. So that's what I do, aside from being the secretary and taking notes at board meetings. Recently, I was invited to be an advisory board member of the Black Yoga Teacher Alliance, which is an amazing organization which exists to educate, train, and support black yoga teachers in America. And they do awesome work. So these types of organizations in the yoga world in America are quite important because the consumerism and the commercialism of yoga in America largely was pushed forward by companies who were advertising white women, often with blonde hair and always skinny and fit and, good looking, as the face of yoga. And this has been done for a few decades now. So much so that when I first started teaching these young men in South Jamaica, Queens, they said, we're not going to do yoga. Yoga's for rich white women. And I thought to myself, how did they know that? Like, these guys are from Queens, no yoga schools near where they live. They've never been in a yoga class, but yet not having proximity to a yoga school, never having been in a yoga class, not being in a yoga or wellness culture, how do they know that yoga in America is for rich white women? Advertising. So this goes back to what we were talking about before with what are the changes that I saw in yoga over the years. And the consumerism aspect of it was pushing forward through deliberate marketing campaigns a look of yoga. And the look was white, and the look was young, and the look was attractive, and the look was skinny, and the look was supple. This is what they call ableism and white privilege in yoga. So these other organizations that are coming up, and also the different schools that are coming up that are focusing on either black and brown culture or black culture, are very important because this balance needs to shift in America. And it's starting to shift after George Floyd. But a lot of people are very cynical about the way they see it shifting because they go, oh, here's a yoga ad with a black woman in it now or a brown woman in it now. And they're only doing it because they feel that they need to diversify in order for people to buy their product, which
it's a corporate decision.
They probably are. And so there's a lot of cynicism even with this new branding of yoga. So who's it up to? It's up to the people who are actually practicing to make those changes and make those shifts, to make sure that their studios are more integrated and more diverse, and to be intentional about that. And it's hard to figure out how to do that if you've never thought about it before. I'm very happy that within our school in Manhattan, we have a lot of Indian students coming and practicing. That makes me really happy because yoga's from India. And I don't want a studio which is only filled with one type of person. I want a studio which is filled with all types of people. It's New York City, for crying out loud. We have all types of people there. They should all feel like they can walk into a yoga class and take it and be happy. But that's not what's been happening. So through marketing, through cost, through the idea projected that, oh, you need to wear this clothing. I can't tell you how many times people have said, oh, yeah, I was thinking of going, but I don't have the right clothing to go, and it's so expensive, or what am I going to wear? And why even thinking about what you have to wear? To put on a pair of cut-off sweatpants, you're fine. Throw on an old T-shirt. You don't cover yourself in petrochemicals. So that's some stuff, and I think that things are changing, and it's good. But we all need to participate in this conversation about it, and it is important because otherwise the wrong message is sent, and then someone who could benefit from yoga might otherwise not do it because they think it's for somebody else. But guess what? It's not. It's for you, and you, and you, and you, and everyone else. It's for all of us. So we need to be leaders in changing this perception of what yoga is. And these multi-million and billion-dollar clothing corporations maybe should rethink their strategy. They're not going to because they've gotten too much money from it already.
And
this is why I'll never get an Aloe sponsorship. Not that I want one. Yeah. God bless them. Let them do good work. But, this is what's happening. This is what's happening on the streets. And what's happening on the streets makes a country.
Sure.
And our country is divided right now in a lot of different directions. A lot of countries are divided, but our country is super divided right now. And a lot of that is playing out in acts of violence and racism, anti-Semitism, sexism. So we got work to do.
Right at the beginning you mentioned you were into punk rock as a kid. So was there ever an identity crisis as to the kid who loved punk rock and Eddie, the yoga teacher?
Not really. And I didn't have that conflict with music either because I was playing in punk rock bands and I was playing in other types of bands as well. But I was also realizing that I wasn't really a musician, that I could play guitar, but I wasn't a good musician. And so this was not going to be the route for me to follow. So that was pretty easy to give up. And I realized the same with art too, because I liked painting and all that. And I thought, I don't know if I have it in me to be an artist, but I did feel I had it in me to do yoga. And I was printing T-shirts as well, designing T-shirts, and I thought that that was something I had a skill set for, and I still think that I do. So I do a lot of T-shirt designing still. That's actually part of the way that we help to fund our temple. So when you start to gain a new narrative about yourself because of yoga, meditation, spirituality, etc., you get to examine some of your earlier narratives and discard them because you know that's not who you are anymore. So I jumped in fairly quickly to this narrative of a yoga person. And then at a certain point, I dropped the narrative of a yoga person as well and picked up, other narratives of who I thought I wanted to be and or how I wanted to be or what narratives I didn't want to have. So the ability to change narrative deliberately is actually the role of an artist in some ways. And I'm not comparing myself to any artist here, especially the one I'm about to mention, but if you look at someone like David Bowie, who most people who know me know that he's a big part of actually my spiritual growth, he changed characters all the time, and he dropped narratives and he pulled on new ones, but he was always the actor underneath it. He was never the narrative. So you get to realize those are roles that I'm playing, but I'm the actor underneath it. Who's the one who's choosing the role? And that's very cool. Who's the one that's choosing the role? When you know who the one who is choosing the role, you can play different roles and not be attached to them. And then when you feel like not playing a role, you don't have to. Even now that I'm doing this degree in science, which is geared towards science research, I wonder if I have it in me to actually do research. Like I've taken part in research and written protocols, but I haven't had to crunch numbers or do that stuff or submit papers to journals. And I have been looking closely at, especially this semester, at what it takes to produce a good paper. And I think maybe I'm not cut out to be a scientist, but I might be cut out to be someone who writes about philosophy, particularly yogic philosophy, and make hypotheses about where there are intersections between yoga science and Western science, and what correlates could be there that we could look at more and maybe investigate. But I don't know if I'm the one to investigate those correlates. But there's always people who make propositions or suppositions, and then better minds and better hands go ahead and investigate it if it seems worthwhile. So I'm thinking these days that that might be something which I'd be happy doing because I like doing that already. Maybe it's something that I could, not necessarily be quote unquote good at, but something that I would find fulfilling in regards to my interest in science, which I have a great interest in science. So I don't know if that's lazy science or what it might be, but I've just been, as we talk about changing narratives and stuff like that. And, so as we go through our lives, we're going to keep on having the opportunity to do new things and do things in different ways and find what we're good at and find what we feel is fulfilling or find what we feel needs to be done or should be done and then do it. And have the good sense to not try to do things that maybe we're not really cut out for, even if we thought it was a good idea. Going back to Gita, which I like to quote a lot, it's better to do your own dharma poorly than the dharma of another well. So it's always thinking about purpose. And it's also okay to do your own dharma really well rather than the dharma of someone else really poorly, which is what I think would happen if I tried to do real research.
No, but I think you're being overly humble by calling your research not real research. I think so many people will sort of be introduced to yoga because of the work you do. Which brings me to my next question. What is next on the horizon for your work in research?
I have no idea. But I think the idea of integration is really important in regards to all of the things we've been speaking about at the conference, and the intersection between science and spirituality is not a new intersection. It's been around for a long, long time, and we keep talking about it and applying new learnings to ancient practices. Some of the things I spoke about in my lecture today were the foundation for a book I wrote a few years ago that looked at the correlates between Western ideas of the nervous system and Eastern views or yogic views of the nervous system, what some of those correlates were and how we could understand what's happening to us physiologically when we do yoga. And I was very surprised how nicely received it was by a lot of people who said, this really helps me to make sense of what's happening when I practice and why I practice, etc. So I think that the drawing in of material that is the work of other people, their research about physiological systems, and etc., and then applying it to the things that we're doing, if there's a reasonable overlap, can be helpful for people, especially if, as Ed Kissinger said, it has the benefit of being true. And that's what we're hoping for. So right now I'm starting to look into the endocrine system. I was looking at the nervous system a lot over the past years. Now I'm looking more into the endocrine system. And I feel that the substances and hormones and neurotransmitters that are helping to mediate emotions and mood and states of mind and states of feelings that are largely mediated by these substances, these are changing states of consciousness, and that we have unchanging states as well, or an unchanging state, witness state, that is the thing we're trying to form a relationship with in yoga. And that we can use these changing states and we can be deliberate about what substances we're releasing to create particular states so that we form a better relationship with witness consciousness. So now I'm looking a little bit more into that, and I'm trying to make the time in my own brain and on my own fingers to write another book looking into this and looking into the endocrine system. And that'll tie into the immune system as well. So changing states, underlying traits, and non-changing states as well. That's kind of what I'm going to look at next. Because the changing states aren't bad. We need them in order to operate. But we want to make sure that we can self-regulate what those are. And if a state
and not be at their mercy. In a sense.
And if a state comes up which is not a uncomfortable one, to be able to identify it, know what it is. And if knowing the name of the substance which is associated with that feeling, if knowing the name dopamine is associated with rising to challenge and the excitement that comes from it, then that's great if that's going to help you. If knowing that a branch of your nervous system that helps you move into the healing response is called the vagal nerve complex, that's great. You should know that if that makes you happy. I like knowing that because it helps me speak to people who are not in the choir, so to speak. It's nice to preach to the choir because the choir amplifies. What happens when you with a choir? You say something good, they all go, amen, or they sing along with you, and that amplifies the sound, and that's good too. But then sometimes you need a language to speak to people who are not in the choir, and interesting conversations can happen from that. And so having another language to use, like science, that everybody knows these days because it's easily Googleable, creates interesting opportunities for connection.
It's amazing how you are applying the vocabulary and language of science to a field that was previously considered very separate from it.
Right. And that brings up a good point also, like, why should I value knowing the word Muladhara Chakra or Surya Nadi more than I would value knowing what is the operation of serotonin or oxytocin? Why should I value one thing more than the other when they're just names and forms.
Sure.
That it's just nama and rupa. And if you follow Vedanta, all of those are illusory. And if you follow Sankhya, they're just mutations of the gunas, taking different names and forms that might have very similar operations. So, and then in the end, it's just language.
It's just language, sure.
But, we get judgmental. I do all the time, daily basis.
Well, thank you so much, Eddie, for sitting down. It's been 1.5 hours. You've had a long day. I feel we haven't even started talking about the real stuff. I mean, the music.
Yeah, exactly. We haven't gotten to the Beastie Boys, to David Bowie, to the Clash, to your, current favorite record. Okay, what's your current listen? Turn on your iPhone. What's the first song that comes on?
The magnetic fields. I'm quoting Spotify Wrapped because I don't even remember what I played this morning. But my Spotify Wrapped said I listened to the magnetic fields the most last year. Magnetic
Fields.
Absolutely, Cuckoo was my most favorite song.
I have not heard that. I will listen to it. So this is okay. I'm gonna get my phone.
He's this one guy. It's one of those one guy bands. It's driven by this one person who's the lyricist and the instrumentalist, and he did an album called 69 Love Songs, which was just that. It was 69 songs.
All I'm doing is I'm looking to see what song comes up automatically on Apple Music. You can cut this out of your podcast if you want to.
No. For you,
Clamp Down, live at the Lewisham Theatre, The Clash.
Wow.
There you go. Lewisham Odeon. It's probably 1977. All right, Magnetic Fields, I'll look them up.
Yeah. My Spotify is giving me Boy in the Bubble. It was a remix of the Paul Simon song from Graceland.
Oh, there you go.
But this is an album of remixes that I listen to a lot, actually.
Okay.
The whole album, Graceland, has been remixed by EDM DJs.
Wow.
And it's phenomenal. It's
That's
really
cool.
something. And thank you, Eddie. Thank you for sitting down and talking with us. It's been really fascinating. And thank you for sharing the journey with us. I wish we had more time and we could carry on talking about more stuff. But Nitin is probably asleep.
He is asleep. Well,
yeah. But thank you so much. And
thank you.
We hope to have you back here whenever it's possible for you and your wife to make it.
I'm sure I will return back here, definitely. I'll be back in India next year. I'll be back in Hyderabad. I will definitely come here and visit.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Eddie. That was lovely. So that was my conversation with Eddie Stern. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. To hear more such conversations, please subscribe to this channel, or you can also find us on Spotify on the Kanha Cast channel, that is KANACAST. Thank you for listening. This is Hill Dog signing off. Namaste and woof woof.